Good day, my name is Lilly Verhagen. I work at the Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, and I also hold an appointment in Stellenbosch University, Cape Town, South Africa. And I'd really like to thank the ESPID Board and the ESPID Committee for Scientific Affairs and Awards for providing me with the ESPID Fellowship Award that made this work possible. Respiratory tract infections in children. Despite the identification of blood biomarkers that will in the future better be able to predict whether we deal with a viral or a bacterial respiratory tract infection, we are not quite there yet. And also, blood draws are usually only possible in hospital settings, which is not where most of the children with a respiratory tract infection present. My project is about zooming in on the respiratory mucosal level to see whether we can use mucosal sampling that is non-invasive, such as saliva, for more informative measurements that can help us to appropriately assess with which infection we are dealing and how we should be treating it. Now, this is the outline of the next 5 minutes of my talk. I'm going to talk a bit more about me and then show you how mucosal antibody measurements may be better be able to discriminate with what infection we are dealing and what the clinical outcome is. So my career has really evolved around respiratory tract infections. And over the past year, I've lived and worked in several places where I took samples, mucosal samples, mostly saliva, but also other mucosal samples from children presenting with acute or chronic respiratory tract infections. Currently, I'm based in Venezuela, the Caribbean, and that is unfortunately the reason I cannot be with you today. Now, let's move to the project of my ESPID Fellowship Award. And for this project, I made use of data from a cohort of children that was included between 2016 and 2019 in 2 Dutch hospitals. And from these children, presenting with recurrent respiratory tract infections, we took samples, saliva samples and serum samples to measure antibodies against 3 different viruses. Influenza, which was the main theme of this project, but also RSV and SARS-CoV-2. Now, it's important to note here that the sample collection took place before the pandemic started. Yet we did measure antibody binding against SARS-CoV-2, so none of these children had been exposed to this virus. Now, moving over to the results, in this slide I will show you that the mucosal antibody levels were highly correlated. Now, what do I mean with that? Here, what you see on the x-axis is saliva IgA levels against SARS-CoV-2 that none of the children had been exposed to. And on the y-axis, you see saliva IgA levels against influenza. Now, what you can see here is that there's a very strong correlation between the two. So the response or the antibody levels against one virus apparently are very similar to the response against another virus. So this suggests that we are measuring the same response. In other words, we are probably measuring here a consistent pool of polyreactive antibodies binding to different viruses, even viruses that the system had not encountered before in the saliva. Now, the next question obviously is, how is this for serum? And here you can see the difference. Each blue dot here depicts a statistically significant correlation. And you can see for saliva that there's statistically significant correlations between each of these antibody level responses for all the different viruses. Whereas for serum, you hardly see any correlations. And with additional measurements, we were able to assess that this polyreactive antibody pool in saliva is about 25% of the total antibodies, whereas this is only 2% for serum. So a very significant result. What do we get from this? What do we conclude from this? That if we compare the two systems, the respiratory tract with the systemic immune system, we find this pool of polyreactive antibodies responding against different viruses or binding to different viruses in the respiratory tract that is not there in the systemic tract in serum. Now, and it's logical if you think about the function of these antibodies. So the respiratory tract is continuously exposed to potential pathogens. So its function is to just block any pathogen that comes in, even if the body hasn't seen that before. where there's that one pathogen that then invades the mucosal barrier and manages to potentially cause an invasive infection. That's the one that you get a targeted systemic immune response to. Now, finally, I'm going to show you two results of how these antibody measurements are related to clinical outcome. First, we saw that the higher levels of polyreactive saliva IgA were linked to less viral detection during the course of the winter season in these children. And secondly, we saw that higher levels of saliva polyreactive IgA and IgG were linked to less episodes of recurrent pneumonia in these children. And that is important because these recurrent pneumonia episodes are mostly related to morbidity and mortality. Now, zooming out, what can we learn from this? I think that when we zoom in on the respiratory mucosa, we can really see how we can use these non-invasive samples to understand and therefore appropriately treat respiratory tract infections in children. Now, thank you very much for your attention. Thanks again to ESPID for providing me with the fellowship awards, and really thanks to all the great people and teams that I've worked with over the past years, which is in the end what makes this work so enjoyable.